Alright, enough theory. Let's talk about how you can create a pod. Here's an example of a YAML config file for a pod. The pod holds a container which prints the first 1000 prime numbers. There are 4 key sections of the config file: the API version, kind, metadata, and spec. Every component config file will have these sections, although the format of these fields will differ from one kind of object to the next. The API version defines the version of the config file schema. Honestly, I rarely think about the API version because I don't write config files from scratch very often. I just copy and modify an existing config file. Next we have the kind field. It holds a string which indicates the type of Kubernetes component that this config file defines. The metadata section holds things like the name of the component, various labels, and annotations. The name of this pod is primes, and the name of the config file is primes-pod.yaml. Note that there's no relationship between the two. They were both arbitrarily chosen by me. Next we have a label. It can be used to select the pod as the target of various operations. We'll go over labels more in the next chapter. Finally, the spec section contains all of the fields which define the desired state of the component. At any given moment, the object, i.e. the Kubernetes cluster component, may not match up with the desired state described in the spec section of the config file. After all, the config file is just the template for the object. This pod's spec only has a containers field. The containers field is an array of one or more containers which live and run in the pod. In this example, the pod has a single container named primes. Every container in a pod must have a unique name. It must be made up of no more than 63 alphanumeric characters and hyphens. The image field specifies the Docker image used to create the container. So the example pod pulls the image true Kubernetes /1000 primes with the tag 1.0 from Docker Hub. Later, I'll show you how to pull images from private registries. Now, you might be worried that you'll need to memorize the exact config file format for each different kind of Kubernetes object. Thankfully, that's not the case. When you create a new config file, you'll usually just copy another config file of the same kind. You'll then modify the copy to suit your needs. Okay, in the beginning, config files can make your eyes cross, but don't worry. You'll be able to read them at a glance with a little practice. Here's a little bit of advice. The first thing that I look at is the kind field. This lets me know what the structure of the config file will be. Then I focus on the spec section because it is always the heart of the config file. I almost never look at the API version, and I only glance at the metadata as needed.